My name is Gauri Srinivasan. I am the Director of Policy and Programs with the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. The Federation is the national voice for Canada's 90,000 researchers in the humanities and social sciences. Our membership comprises over 160 universities and scholarly associations across Canada. To begin, on behalf of all of us, I would like to acknowledge and give thanks for being on unceded Algonquin territory this morning. This morning's talk will take place in English with simultaneous interpretation, which is available via cell phone, for which you will need headsets. Si vous avez besoin d'interprétation simultanée, les détails se retrouvent sur vos tables. Nous avons aussi beaucoup d'écouteurs à l'inscription, donc si vous aurez besoin pour la lecture, servez-vous-en, s'il vous plaît. Je souhaite remercier l'honorable Greg Fergus, qui est notre député parrain de la série Voir grand. C'est grâce à M. Fergus que ces événements peuvent se tenir dans cet magnifique restaurant du Parlement. And I know there are many of you distinguished in the room, but I would just like to also recognize the Honorable Carleton Bennett, Minister for Crown and Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, who's joined us this morning. Welcome, Minister. We'd also like to thank our friends and partners at the Social Science Humanities Research Council for their continued support for the Big Thinking on the Hill series. This is our final lecture for 2017. Throughout this year, Big Thinking has marked the 150th anniversary of Confederation by thinking about this country's past, which of course goes back much farther than 150 years. And by looking ahead and asking what kind of place Canada could be in 10, 20, and 150 years from now. What are the forces shaping us, our communities, and our world? We believe strongly that these are questions that the humanities and social sciences can and must help us all answer. Today's lecture on the promise of reconciliation asks a timely question given the government's commitment to a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples. Will this time be any different? Je suis heureuse que nous avons Professeur Graham et Newhouse avec nous aujourd'hui pour nous lancer dans la discussion. Their research insights and deep histories with Canadian policymaking will be valuable to us all. Dr. Katherine Graham is a senior advisor to the provost at Carleton University and former dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs. She has worked in the field of Indigenous policy and administration for over 3 decades, both in academia and in policymaking. Notably, she served on the staff of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. She was the program chair, also along with Professor Newhouse, of the 2016 RCAP Plus 20 National Forum on Reconciliation called Sharing a Land, Sharing a Future, of which the Federation was a proud partner. Dr. David Newhouse is Onondaga from the Six Nations of the Grand River community near Brantford, Ontario. He is chair of the Chanie Wenjack School of Indigenous Studies. He is professor of Indigenous Studies and professor in the School of Business at Trent University. His policy portfolio includes work with the policy team on economics for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the benchmarking committee of the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board. He also currently serves as the science officer for the Aboriginal Peoples Health Research Committee for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So we couldn't be in better hands. Veuillez accueillir avec moi Katherine et David.
I want to thank you, first of all, for coming and thanking the Federation for asking us. I'm David Newhouse. I'm not Katherine Graham, the way we're going to proceed is I'm going to speak for a bit, and Katherine's going to speak, and then I'll come back, and then we'll have questions and hopefully answers. Okay, and hopefully you'll ask questions that we can answer at this point. So. One of my life goals was to become a science officer, because when growing up I was a big fan of Star Trek. And so in my work with CIHR, I finally made it. Okay? So that's one thing off the list, okay, as well. So I want to talk, I think, today, and we want to talk today about reconciliation, right? And reconciliation promises a new Canada, right? It promises a new relationship, and it promises effectively a new world, and it promises to create places of dignity and respect within Canada for Indigenous people. And so we began to ask ourselves the question, what is this promise, and will it be different? And what we want to try to do this morning very quickly is try to show you that we think that there is incredible potential here, and that things are very different than they were many years ago in 1969. And so the promise is really that things will be different. And we're asking ourselves, are the conditions right for things to be different? Reconciliation, I've been speaking in many places about reconciliation. And I've been talking about reconciliation as the largest national project since the beginning of the country. It's even bigger than the National Railway. It is of that import, right, in Canadian public life. And it's a project that requires all of us to become involved, and is a project that promises to change the face of Canada as well. We think reconciliation is fairly new, right? But at least I'm beginning to think that reconciliation has been underway for close to half a century. It began really in 1969 and 1971 with the withdrawal of the white paper by the Trudeau government. And with the Supreme Court decision around Calder, we begin to recognize that there might be something called Aboriginal rights. And so in this period of time, right, we have the beginnings of what we now call reconciliation, although we didn't call it reconciliation right at that period of time. So I want to talk a bit, okay, about what has happened since then. One of the challenges of reconciliation is that we look at each other through the lens of problem. That Canada has tended over the last 150 years to think of Indians as problems, and it adopted a policy of civilization and assimilation. And those see Indians, Indigenous people, as problems to be addressed, as problems to be solved. At the same time, the Indigenous community has also looked at Canada through the lens of a problem. And I came up with this idea when I was asked a few years ago to write a 10,000-word paper on the history of Indigenous politics in Canada, and to do it in 4 months. And that's quite the challenge. And so I read, and the paper was due in February, due in March, and in middle of February, I hadn't written anything. I didn't know what I was going to say. And in the middle of the night, I came up with this idea that Indians are thinking about Canada as a problem, and thinking about how to begin to solve the Canada problem. And and can we move, I guess, beyond this idea of problem? Right? If we think of ourselves as problem, then we're locked into a particular way of thinking and acting with each other. Is there a way in which we can begin to move, right, our thinking beyond the idea of problem? And that's going to be quite the challenge, because we are coming at this issue of reconciliation after a 114-year period that I call the long assault. I discovered that in my talk with corporations, that when I talked with colonization, that the conversation stopped, that corporate leaders did not think of themselves as being part of a corporate enterprise. So I had to find a way to begin to talk to corporate leaders about reconciliation in a way that they could understand and become part of it as well. And so I talked about the long assault. It's a 114-year period that began in 1857 and ended in 1971 with the withdrawal of the white paper. They started with the the Graduate Civilization Act, and ended with the white paper. And what the assault did was attempt to transform Indians and to dispossess Indians of their lands, their cultures, their traditions. And the state in this period of time used its full power in order to transform Indians. And if you're the subject of state power for that length of time, you can begin to see, right, what the effects would be upon Indigenous communities. All of the poor economic conditions, all of the poor social conditions, all of the things, all of the health conditions, all of the poor conditions that we see within Indigenous communities arise out of living right under the long assault. And the Supreme Court Justice Beverly McLaughlin described it, I think, quite aptly, that what the effect of the long assault, okay, was cultural genocide. It wasn't an attempt to eradicate Indians physically, but an attempt to eradicate their culture. And so when you're subject to that, the effect is going to be quite astounding. And that the healing from the long assault is not going to occur overnight, that the healing from the long assault is going to require generations. I hope not the 7 generations that Senator Sinclair talks about. I hope we can make some progress much more quickly, okay, than that as well. And so we come to reconciliation, right, with that background and with that in people's minds. Indigenous people, of course, have not been sitting back and letting things happen. They have been trying to deal with the Canada problem in a whole series of activities. And I describe the Canada problem as how to live with Canada and how to live within this new entity, Canada. And Indigenous people have been using ideas from our own cultural traditions, our own intellectual history, in order to solve the Canada problem. And we bring to the table our idea of relationship, our idea that we need to develop a relationship with this new entity called Canada. And I base at least my thinking upon an unashambled idea about the creation of the world, in which as human beings we live in a world in which everything has power and everything is alive, and that as human beings we're the last created and the least powerful. So the way that you survive in the world in which you are the least powerful is you develop relationships, and you have to develop good relationships. So animating Indigenous solutions to the Canada problem, right, is this idea of a relationship. And you see this over and over and over again in the political discourse of Indigenous leaders as well. And the Canada problem, right, is being tackled in 2 large clumps of activities. Right? The first one is what I call political recognition. And that's the work of politicians and lawyers and constitutional experts, and focuses upon constitutional amendments, land claims and Aboriginal title, self-government, treaties, and is the focus of Aboriginal rights, right? And we see, right, all this activity that's occurring across the country in the courts, in legislatures around the country. Second is the quality of life, and that is trying to find a way to live well within this country that is called Canada. The first one deals with how to live with Canada. And so the quality of life focuses on trying to improve education, trying to improve employment prospects, and trying to improve the quality of employment for Indigenous people, improving the health, improving housing, right, ensuring that cultures and languages are revitalized and are used as part of our daily life, and then beginning to focus upon the development of Indigenous peoples as communities and as economies. Right? And you see a whole series of organizations begin to emerge that are focused on the quality of life activities. And there are now 6,000 Aboriginal organizations that have emerged in order to deal with the quality of life. On the political recognition, we have the National Indigenous Organizations and all of the political leaders, right, as well. And they're all working in order to try to solve the Canada problem, trying to create these places of dignity and respect. And so from the Indigenous perspective, solving the Canada problem, right, is a multi-generational effort, right? It's going to take a lengthy period of time. It occurs at many places across the country. It's multi-year and multi-actor. There are many people involved in trying to solve the Canada problem. It's an incredibly complex activity that is not coordinated, but that has a place in it for all Aboriginal organizations, all Aboriginal leaders, and communities. There is, right, at the same time, right, an agenda that Canada has set out, right, an agenda that was laid out by the Prime Minister in the speech from the throne in 2015, in which he says Canada is going to develop a new relationship, right? And we've heard this before, right? We've heard this since 1971, right? For the last almost 50 years, but we've heard this promise of a new relationship. And right, he also said it again, right, in December before the chiefs in Special Assembly. So he said it in two places. One is in the House in the speech from the throne, and then secondly is before the chiefs. And so there's a large commitment to developing this new relationship. We also need, I think, to realize that when we begin to talk about this relationship, right, as I hopefully begin to show you, that there is an incredible amount of thinking that goes behind the Indigenous part of the effort at reconciliation. Right? And Nathan Obed, who is the president of the Inuit Emerita Kanamani, last November at the RCAP 20 forum said, when you come to meet us, please remember that we have been thinking about our relationship with Canada for a very long time. And one of the projects that I've started is to begin to go back over the last 200 years and try to capture the talks and speeches of Indigenous leaders in their talk about Canada to show you that there is, in fact, an extremely long conversation about Canada, and that Indigenous people have been thinking about this new entity for a long time. And so we can't ignore, right, what Indigenous people are thinking, and we tend, I think, to ignore it, right, when we begin to talk about reconciliation. What is also different from 1969 is that we have a set of what I call reconciliation documents that point the way. And we have the report, right, the 1983 report of the Special Committee on Indian Self-Government. We have the final report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which contains an Aboriginal vision of Canada. We have two statements of reconciliation that were promulgated, or at least that were read by, first of all, the Honourable Jane Stewart, the Minister of Indian Affairs, and then read by the Honourable Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister, in 2008. We also have the 2015 report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then we lastly, right, we have, in the midst of all this, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada has said that it will adopt. So we have a set of thinking that guides us forward. So we don't need to do too much more thinking. Our question now is how to begin to translate all of these ideas into action. And we also have, right, as I said before, an intellectual foundation, right, that comes from Indigenous political traditions. Robert Warrior, right, who is an Osage scholar at now the University of Arizona, right, says that Indigenous people have been following a consistent political philosophy for the last 2 centuries in their dealing with Europeans. And he talks about this as a Kaswanta philosophy. And he says that the purpose of Indigenous philosophy is to develop a relationship of mutual benefit. And you see this again, right, in the political discourse of Indigenous political leaders. How are we going to work together? How are we going to come to an agreement? How are we going to make decisions? how are we going to do something that's going to benefit both of us as well. So there is, again, a lot of thinking on the Indigenous side as to how to reconcile as well. We also have another document that is a reconciliation document, and that's the Constitutional Act. That should be 1982, right, Section 35(1), which begins to recognize something called the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. That we're in the process of trying to decide exactly what that means. We also have another principle called the honor of the Crown, right, which we can bring to the table, right, in terms of thinking about the principles for moving forward. There's also a set of legal foundation decisions by the Supreme Court that were not present in 1969 that talks about how we're going to live together and talks about what it is that we ought to do. And we live now, right, under the court order, right, of the Supreme Court that says that, let's face it, we're all here to stay. We have to find a way to work it out. So we have, right, an incredible amount of thinking about reconciliation that we did not have in 1969. And so when I begin to put all of these together, right, and begin to think about what reconciliation is, right, I begin to think about reconciliation as consisting of 4 sets of activities. And I devised a chart as a way of trying to help people to find a place for themselves in reconciliation, in this large national effort. So there are 4 areas of activities. First one is equity, that is closing the gap, improving health, improving education, improving incomes, improving communities. And that's the work of organizations, of NGOs, right, of political leaders who are pushing strongly, right? There's also the work of government in programming. So you've got a set of activities there. Secondly is harmony, and that is improving the relationship between Indigenous and settler Canadians. That is focused upon cross-cultural awareness, cross-cultural relationships, dealing with racism, dealing with prejudice and discrimination. Right? A whole series of activities there that are undertaken by both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Right? And then the third one is recognition and restoration of Indigenous nations. This is all of the work that talks about the development of Indigenous governments and changing the machinery of government, changing all of the relationships. And Catherine's going to talk, all about this. And then lastly is a critical conversation about Canada, is where do Indigenous people fit within the body politic of Canada? How are we going to incorporate Indigenous people, right, within the political process of Canada, within the political community of Canada? And how are we going to incorporate them as Indigenous people, right? Because we've discovered, that this is not, that our effort to have Indigenous people participate as something else is not going to work. And so Catherine's going to now talk a bit about the reconciliation, and the federal agenda.
Thank you very much to the Federation for organizing this morning's talk, and thank you all for coming. I'd just like to make one thing perfectly clear before we start. I have never wanted to be a chief science officer. My goal in life is to be the best canoe maker I can. So, David and I have been companions and research partners for a long time, but we have our differences. I'm going to talk a little more specifically, perhaps, about the policy agendas for reconciliation. And we've identified really three areas of work that needs to be done, of work that is in process. And these, of course, are not mutually exclusive, but they are interacting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Canada agenda, the Indigenous agenda, and the federal agenda. And given where we are at the moment, probably spend a little bit more time on the federal agenda than on the other two. But in terms of the Canada agenda, our view is that there are really three aspects that all Canadians need to consider. The first is the need for having the kind of critical conversation about Canada that David alluded to as he was speaking. What is our real history? What are the inherent rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada? What is the nature of the relationship? And so from that understanding, we get to the second element of the Canada agenda, and that is how do we establish and the things that we need to do to establish harmonious Indigenous settler relations. And our argument and a lot of what underlies what we are saying is, of course, based in history. And an important element of history is the work of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which David and I were both heavily engaged in. And regrettably, that work has been largely lost. It is returning to us in many ways, but we need to have a public discussion of the really considered views of the Royal Commission. And I think that one of the important things that we need to remember is that the Royal Commission established 4 principles to guide the nature of the relationship between Canada and Canadians and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Those 4 principles were recognition, respect, sharing, and responsibility. So we need to think about how we are going to operationalize those 4 principles going forward. That's a central element of the Canada agenda. The third element of the Canada agenda concerns treaties. And it's very common for people to say, well, we have treaties in Canada. We have, we have First Nations who have treaties. There are numbered treaties, there are named treaties. We have modern treaties concluded since the 1970s. But we tend, in our thinking, to think about treaties as belonging to First Nations, Inuit, or Métis people. I am not Indigenous, but I am a treaty person. We are all treaty people because we have an obligation, mutual obligations that were established under the treaties. It is something I feel very keenly about, and it's something that Canadians, all Canadians, should be aware of and should be acting upon. So that's the third pillar of the Canada agenda, in our view. The Indigenous agenda is focused really on a sense of self, a sense of place as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and a sense of place and a role within what is now Canada. And you can see from the various quotes that are up on the screen at the moment that that agenda is quite fundamental. As David said, no one's going away. So we need to recognize that Indigenous peoples are aware of that and are working in that framework to establish a new relationship. And there are a couple of ways of thinking about that relationship that were articulated very eloquently by Mark and Jennifer Dockstader at the RCAP 20 Forum last year. They include thinking about the relationship as being based in the two-row wampum of peoples moving in parallel, connecting, but moving in parallel. And also the relationship as being formed and informed by the medicine circle, a notion of harmony. So we have some fundamental ingredients, some principles that underlie the Canada and Indigenous agenda. What about the federal agenda? Let me perhaps be a little more specific. There has been considerable action, and David, in his remarks, outlined some of the major things that have happened in terms of policy pronouncements and new stages in the relationship as articulated by the Government of Canada. But there are other things that are going on somewhat behind the scenes. So there is, as we speak, a ministerial working group that is working on the agenda for the new relationship. There is, as we speak, a task force of deputy ministers working on the new relationship. We have obviously seen the announcement and are living through the implementation of the split in the former Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. That, interestingly enough, was a recommendation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which, having been involved in developing that recommendation, gave me great heart. But it is a half step, because as important as the step is, we still don't know what the fiscal relationship will be and how the fundamentals of that relationship will be formed. And that's the next step. And the Royal Commission has some interesting things to say about the fiscal relationship and about implementation of the split. But there are some remaining challenges that I think we want to leave you with as we go forward. The first, and perhaps the most difficult challenge for the federal government, is learning to stand back. This is, and should be thought of as, a mature relationship between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and settler Canadians. The Government of Canada, as I think many would acknowledge, has had a tendency over the time of the Long Assault to take charge of the relationship. What is needed now is to stand back and to be respectful and understand the strengths that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people bring to the relationship and the strengths of the institutions that they are developing. The second federal challenge is to, in a sense, realize the complexity of the challenge and not make false choices. David alluded to the fact that we need to work on the constitutional and legal elements of the relationship and also on closing the gap. We do need to work on both of those things simultaneously. It's not a choice between one or the other. And that makes things more complex, but it's the important way forward. We need to think about the Indian Act, which of course, as everyone acknowledges, is a hugely problematic piece of legislation. My colleague Frances Abel has termed it an ill-fitting boot. It's important to realize that there is work being done on getting out from under the Indian Act. And some of the most important work that is being done by First Nations communities themselves. And so we need to celebrate that work, and the Government of Canada needs to learn from what First Nations who are working so hard to get themselves out from under the Indian Act are doing, and think about what the federal stance should be in the context of what is happening with First Nations. There are some remaining federal challenges that I'll just touch on briefly. The first is culture change within the federal public service. And I don't intend this as a moment of public service bashing at all. I think it's reasonable to suggest that over recent times, the federal public service has been characterized by two things. One is renewal, which means few people remember the past. I encounter students who are today public servants who really don't know what the Royal Commission is or don't know the history at all. They are ahistorical. They are constructs, not of history, but of spreadsheets. And that is the world of the public service, to manage money, to make sure it is spent properly, and that is the metric by which they think they are accounted. And this is, of course, a generalization, but I'm just going to put it out there because we're going to have a dialogue afterwards. But this is not helpful. And so what we really do need is a culture change, and to make public servants aware not only of the broad history of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and settler relations and the history of Canada, but also to enable them to think in new ways about their role and to enable them to facilitate what should be enabling activities with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So, Where are we in managing the process? Reconciliation is long, complex. David and I both hope it doesn't take 7 generations. But we do recognize that we do need to work on this project for a long time, that there's an ongoing need to build public support for this, that there is a need to strengthen the institutions both of Canada and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit institutions so that we can interact respectfully as equals and move forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to David for a couple of concluding comments.
I think it's quite clear, I think, from what we've been saying, is that reconciliation just will not happen. Right? It just can't happen. It's a process that needs to be managed, that requires political commitment at all levels. It requires sustained effort over time. It also requires a willingness to experiment and to try new things. One of the effects of the long assault is that all the assumptions about Indigenous people and about Canada are built into the structures and processes that we use to govern ourselves. And so part of moving forward, part of reconciliation is thinking about those assumptions and then beginning to find new ways of doing things. And that involves considerable risk. It also requires considerable goodwill. The biggest challenge, though, is the cynicism that comes from, we've heard it all before, right? And we need to overcome this, and that's going to require for us to talk about what progress we are making, and to show as we go along that we are indeed making some progress. Because the biggest challenge is not seeing anything happen from this large effort as well. And it is a long game. How do we sustain this over generations? We're in this for the long haul. Supreme Court says we're all here to stay, so we have to find a way to work together and try to find a way to reconcile with each other. But I think fundamentally, what we need to begin to recognize if we're going to be successful is that we already have many of the documents, many of the ideas already on the table. And as a country, we've developed them in public fora, and in the courts over the last 3 decades. And so if we turn to those documents and begin to think about how to implement them, then I think we'll be quite successful. And those documents consist both of documents from Indigenous peoples, Indigenous leaders, and also from Canadian institutions, as well. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour ces réflexions, Katherine et David. Nous invitons maintenant les gens à poser des questions. Il y a 2 micros. Non, il y a un micro au milieu de la salle. Donc, c'est important que vous utilisiez le microphone pour qu'on peut faire la traduction. Please feel free to ask questions or make comments in English or French, whichever language you choose. Please identify yourself first and try to keep your questions short. We have just about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, and Gary, thank you. Elizabeth May, Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands. I'm spending a lot of my time with my community. There are, according to the Indian Act, 4 First Nations in my constituency. According to the people within those communities, they are villages within the nation called Saanich. And the Indian Act is only too politely called an ill-fitting boot. It's intolerable. But what I wanted to ask, to keep the political will present for the long journey that will take this country to truly understand what cultural genocide has meant and why Indigenous people in this country just don't get over it. I hear that from people sometimes. We have a huge burden of responsibility of education for settler culture people. And I'd love your thoughts on that, because until we really understand what it meant that in 1867 we set up a system to demolish family ties and to destroy the childhoods of generation after generation, And until settler culture people really understand that that isn't over, I don't see how we'll keep the political will in place, which I acknowledge, Carolyn, we have now. How do we keep that in place for the decades, at minimum of decades this will take?
So I share your view and your concern. Michael Adams has done some survey work to suggest that while there may be some knowledge of the need to reconcile, that knowledge is not very firmly and deeply rooted in many Canadians. So it does start with education. I think that that's a fundamental point, and I think that it's imperative that we essentially rewrite Canadian history. And again, going back to the comment that David made, there are documents that will put us on the path, and there is work that is going on right now that is very helpful in putting us on the path. It varies because, I hate to say it, but we're in Ottawa, so everything is federal, provincial, territorial. But there are some provinces that are doing really important work. I would identify Alberta as one that is a leader in terms of curriculum development. But I attended a lecture on Aboriginal policy last spring, and the audience included 2 young women who attend Glebe Collegiate, just over here. And one of them had the courage to ask the lecturer, or the guest lecturer, the first question. And at the age of 16, she said, "I'm in grade 12, and I've had the unit on reconciliation, and I know nothing." And so that's where we're starting. And you know, it's not easy, but as again, there are documents there that will enable us. There's knowledge there that will enable us. We just have to take up the work of developing that history. And again, the Royal Commission, if you look at the first 2 volumes of the Royal Commission report, that's a different history than certainly the history I was taught many, many years ago.
I think I want to add to the answer by looking at this from the perspective of business leadership, right? If you have an objective you want to achieve in business, you appoint someone to lead the effort, right? And so I think this is an incredibly large, complex effort. So I think it needs a ministerial level appointment, right, of someone who has that responsibility that is supported by an institution, right? I mean, I always think of institutions as organizations that we create to do our thinking for us, right? And so we need an institution to do our thinking for us that's going to bring people together and advise a minister, right? And that, I think, allows for longevity, right, as well, because I think it's difficult to create ministers, maybe not, but okay. But I think we need, right, someone at that level if we're going to be successful, because it just cannot happen, right? I've been looking at reconciliation efforts around the world, right, and the slide that you saw there came from efforts out of Africa, right, after Civil War, and so it does need that sort of level as well, in addition to all of the educational work that needs to be done at the primary, secondary, and tertiary level, okay, as well.
Thank you. So good morning. My name is Adam Levine, and I am a public servant. I definitely not take offense to what you said. I totally agree. There needs to be a culture shift, so thank you for that. My question is, do you see a role, if any, of the Crown, the government, in helping Indigenous groups, especially First Nations, in moving from the current structure under the Indian Act, 640 plus First Nations, down to a more traditional way of governance, down to 50, et cetera, cultural groupings? So what is the role, if any, of the Crown and government in that? Thank you.
That's a large challenge, right? I mean, I was in government in Indian Affairs in 1985, and we met with the Treasury Board, right? And at that point, the Treasury Board saw the country as dotted by small First Nations, and said, "Why can't you just pull them all together?" Right? And so, right? And we tried to explain that you could not, right? So I think the role the government can do is to help to foster local initiatives, right, that bring people together, that helps them to begin to develop, right, this idea of Aboriginal nations that the Royal Commission talked about, right? So there's an enabling role, and that comes, I think, through funding, right? I mean, we can't do without much funding, okay, as well. So I think there's a role right there. Okay.
Just before I call our next speaker, or questioner, I just want to say there is room for a couple more questions. So if those of you holding back and thinking, do I have this question together? It's time to get it together.
I'd just like to maybe add a little bit to what David said. In my remarks, I said it was important for the federal government to stand back. I think standing back is a really important element of enabling nationhood to emerge. And part of standing back is not just saying, oh, okay, we're out of here. That's not it. But I spend quite a bit of time working in communities, like really small ones. And these really small communities, they are so consumed by project management that they have no time to reflect. They're consumed with reporting, they're consumed with proposal writing, they're consumed with can we get the money and time to actually spend it in the way that we want to spend it. It's really hard to think more deeply other than sort of in a moment of near sleep about the fundamental identity of a nation and how to create a nation when you are on that sort of rabbit wheel.
Yeah, I guess the way that I also try to frame it is that what one is doing is continuing the work of confederation. Right? That what we're trying to do is find a way to bring Indigenous people into confederation as Indigenous people, right, and create places of dignity and respect and power, right, within the confederation. The Indigenous agenda is not a separatist agenda, but I don't hear any Indigenous leader talk about separation from Canada, right? So it's very different in that sense. Okay, I mean the Mohawks talk about a relationship with Canada, right, as well, but Canada is still there, right, as well. So we're talking about how do we then do this, right, as well. And it's going to require us to let go of some of our ideas about what Canada is and think differently about Canada. And that's the big challenge, right?
I'm Reuel Amder, and I write for the West Quebec Post. And I've been puzzled by Prime Minister Trudeau's proposition of a nation-to-nation relationship. And the problem I have with it is that we're dealing with many, many nations. And I have difficulty picturing a nation-to-nation relationship between Canada and an Indian community of 200 people. So I wonder your reflections on that.
I think it's important to reflect that in many instances these communities of 200 people that call themselves First Nations are actually created under the Indian Act. So they're a false construct. They are not, with all due respect to these communities, they are not First Nations. And so a nation-to-nation relationship is more fundamental. It is envisioned as being a more collective relationship with peoples who share identity, culture, language, and history. And the history of themselves as peoples and a history with Canada. So, you're right. There are lots of First Nations who are called First Nations. I think it was a terrible mistake to start calling these places First Nations. But that's not what a nation-to-nation relationship entails.
But I think this is also an example of the way in which the assumptions that fueled the long assault affect our activities today, right? Because the Indian Act, right, began to set Indian communities apart, right, and created a set of structures that we then think about as being natural. And we need then to discard that thinking and then think about what can we re-envision, right? And the Royal Commission, right, talked about this idea of Aboriginal nations as comprising a larger political body than just a small First Nations community. And the challenge, I think, of moving from the Indian Act community, right, to an RCAP community it requires a great deal of discussion, and it also requires us to set aside our fears, but to continue the conversation, because we don't always know what it's going to end up. But you know, when I'm assuming that when the people who met at Charlottetown talked about Canada, they didn't quite know either, and Canada evolved, right? So we have to let this evolve and create a way for it to evolve as well. If not, we're going to be stuck, right, with the Indian Act, and we're stuck in all of those assumptions.
Great. Final question.
Thanks. My name is Rebecca Johnson. I work for the Department of Indigenous Affairs. My question is related to how can we, as a federal public servants or Canadians, ensure that we have a diversity of Indigenous voices within this conversation. My main file is gender-based analysis within the department and ensuring that the full diversity of women's, two-spirited, on reserve, off reserve are being taken into consideration, and we're not just developing new silos and making sure that all the voices are heard. Thank you.
I think hearing diverse voices is crucial to the conversation. I think just one dimension that often gets overlooked, and David and I both feel very strongly about this, is the urban dimension. People who live somewhere else than their home territory, perhaps, or who are in their home territory but find themselves in an urban center, not in their traditional settled community, to the extent that there would be one. I actually am somewhat heartened because I see diverse voices emerging. People are not, they're not afraid. There are always going to be people who try and privilege some voices more than others. But certainly I see indications, sometimes with peaks and then ebbs of diverse voices emerging. There are a number of very strong youth voices out there, right? Two-spirited people are making themselves heard. Women have always been an important part of the national scene. There are always dynamics there, but we will see voices. And so I applaud your desire. I think it's just important to make sure that the opportunity for those voices to be at the table is there, because the voices are out there.
I think very careful consideration of the consultation process, and also the development of some type of institutions, right? Either commissions or councils or committees, and then selecting diverse voices for those committees, right, as well. I mean, one always has to balance the politics, right? We have Indigenous, we have the NIOs, right, which are important, right? And they're going to also try to ensure that diverse voices are present. But I think we have to go a bit beyond that to ensure that there are other voices at the table, and we do that, right, through councils, commissions, committees, those sort of things, okay, as well, and focus upon the issues, okay, as opposed to the identity politics, right, of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. I mean, those are important. You can't ignore them, okay, but we need to bring other voices, okay, in as well. So I don't know whether that helps or not, okay.
Thank you all for your questions. Please join me again in thanking Katherine Newhouse, Katherine Graham, David Newhouse. I would like to thank Catherine and David, whom I merged into a single unit just there. Maybe you'll be in a canoe yet. For their incredibly valuable and insightful reflections. I have just offered them a small token of our appreciation on behalf of the Federation for the hard work I know that goes into preparing one of these lectures and working together to prepare the presentation. Merci encore au CRSH pour leur soutien précieux tout au long de cette série Voir Grand. Merci à l'honorable Greg Fergus, notre député parrain de la série. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today at the Big Thinking Lecture. A video of this presentation will be available shortly on the Federation's website. And we'd just like to close by asking you to be sure to join us again in 2018, starting in February, on February 13th, when we will showcase other important research insights and reflections from the humanities and social sciences. We will keep you all informed of the new lineup. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Merci. Bonne journée à tous.